Welcome back to the deep dive, where we take the texts that often get pushed to the side. The dense, the complicated, sometimes the downright daunting ones, and we try to find the stunning blueprint underneath.
And today's book is definitely a candidate for being misunderstood.
Or worse, entirely ignored. It's that book that stands between the sweeping drama of the Exodus and the narrative drive of Numbers and Deuteronomy.
It's the one people tend to skip.
Exactly. Today, we are diving into the Book of Leviticus. And if you think this is going to be some dry recitation of ancient regulations, you are fundamentally mistaken.
I hope so.
Our mission today is to extract the core idea of holiness that governs this entire ancient legal treatise, to understand the logic of atonement, and to see just how profoundly its ethics still influence our concepts of morality and justice today.
And you really can't overstate its importance. I mean, this is the crucial third installment of the Torah. Exodus establishes the covenant.
You agree?
Right. And Leviticus establishes the operating manual for actually maintaining that covenant relationship. If you don't grasp the principles laid out here, so much of the rest of the Bible it doesn't make sense.
Especially certain New Testament books.
Oh, absolutely. The book of Hebrews, for instance, will remain completely closed because it constantly relies on the imagery and the mechanics of this Levitical system to explain Christ's work.
Okay, so let's start with the name, because I think that immediately causes some confusion. We call it Leviticus. Why?
Well, the name in English comes to us through Latin.
The Vulgate.
Yeah, the Latin Vulgate, which translated the Greek Septuagint title, Levitical. And that just means relating to Levites.
Which makes sense on the surface, right? I mean, it is full of instructions for priests, and they were drawn from the tribe of Levi. But is that title really accurate for the whole book?
Not entirely, and that's a common mistake people make. While the book certainly details the rigorous requirements of the priesthood, it's equally, if not more, concerned with the laity.
With the common Israelite.
Exactly. This book is the crucial intersection where the average person learns how to interact with a holy God. It tells them when to approach the sanctuary.
What token to bring and what the priest is supposed to do when they get there.
Precisely. This material was revealed to Moses after the covenant was made. It's the covenant constitution, really.
Yeah.
It details the regulations for religious life, for civil life, all required for Israel to occupy the land of Canaan while God is literally living in their midst.
So if we strip away all the specific laws, the instructions on blood, fat, goats, and even houses, what's the single unifying big idea?
Holiness.
Yeah.
It is the absolute core, the magnetic north of the entire work. The book is instructing Israel on how to fulfill its covenant responsibility, the one stated back in Exodus.
To be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation.
That's the one. This is the how-to guide for that job description.
And this concept of holiness, of being set apart, that's what provides the spiritual fuel for the entire code, isn't it? It's not just about following rules for the sake of following rules.
No, not at all. It's about becoming characteristically similar to the God who chose and redeemed you. That's why the central motto, repeated constantly, is, "Be holy, for I am holy."
A line that gets picked up directly in the New Testament.
Straight from Leviticus, yeah. It establishes that ethics, morality, and ritual are not separate spheres. Holiness demands expression and holy living, and that's maintained through constant obedience.
And the historical impact of the book shows just how vital it was. I mean, this wasn't some technical manual they just filed away.
Far from it. Traditionally, in Judaism, this dense book was the first book taught to children.
Wait, really? Not Genesis with the exciting creation and flood stories, but Leviticus with the rules about skin diseases and burnt offerings? Why on earth?
Because it frames everything. It teaches that the relationship with God is conditioned on holiness and that access to God requires specific, costly methods of atonement. It instills this profound reverence for God's presence before they even get to the historical narratives.
Holiness precedes understanding.
That's a great way to put it. And I mean, the proof is in the pudding. Over half the commentary of the Talmud, that vast compendium of Jewish law and tradition, is dedicated just to understanding the nuances of Leviticus.
Wow. So it really is the blueprint. The blueprint for how a holy, sovereign God could maintain a close relationship with redeemed, yet still desperately sinful people.
It answers the fundamental question. How can you live next door to a consuming fire without being consumed?
Okay, let's unpack this blueprint, starting with that immediate challenge, dealing with sin and maintaining the relationship. The first major section, chapters 1 through 7, details the laws of sacrifice. And this wasn't just, random ritual. It was highly functional.
It had a dual purpose. It was revelatory. It taught the Israelites the precise, non-negotiable mechanism for communion with God. And it was highly regulatory.
Okay.
It demanded specific protocols, precise details, and designated participants.
And I find it helpful to remember that every single offering involved three key parties.
Always.
Yeah.
You have one, the offerer, the person needing reconciliation or just wanting to worship. Two, the offering, the substitute, whether it's an animal or an object. And three, the mediator, the priest, who actually executed the ritual.
And that structure ensured the process was standardized and God-directed, not man-made.
Exactly.
Now, the sacrifices themselves fall into two major families, which I think clarifies their purpose immediately.
It does. First, you have the soothing aroma offerings. These were fundamentally offerings of worship and communion. They symbolized a relationship that's functioning well.
So these are the burnt, the meal, and the peace offerings.
Right. They reveal what's essential for or what results from a healthy, restored relationship with God.
And then the second family is the expiation offerings.
These are the offerings of restoration and repair. This is your sin offering and your trespass offering. And the text is clear. These were decidedly not a sweet savor to God.
Their focus was purely functional.
Purely. It was all about how to repair a broken relationship, how to remove pollution, and how to clear a debt after sin had occurred.
Let's start with the most dramatic one, the burnt offering, from chapter 1. The name itself is pretty striking.
It is. The Greek translation of this sacrifice is holokatoma.
Yeah.
It literally means wholly burned up.
Which is where we get our word Holocaust.
That's the origin, yeah.
Yeah.
And it perfectly describes the ritual. Complete total consumption by fire.
So what was the theological point of burning the whole thing up?
It had that dual function we mentioned. Primarily, it was an expression of the offerer's complete, comprehensive consecration to God. It was a symbolic giving of the life God gave you back to its rightful owner.
A kind of reasonable service, as a later text puts it.
Exactly. But it also made atonement. This was the most common of all the sacrifices. It was offered daily, morning and evening.
Why so frequently?
Because it satisfied God's desire for the love and full dedication of his creatures, but it also addressed his offended justice. It covered both bases.
And the ritual itself stressed this idea of total personal surrender. That's where we get the physical interaction. The offerer had to lay his hand on the animal's head.
This is a really powerful nonverbal moment. The Hebrew term used is samic, which implies real pressure. It wasn't just a light touch.
So you're really connecting with the animal.
You are. It was an act of prayer, of confession, and of identification. It suggested the transference of the life claim, or maybe the guilt, onto this spotless substitute. And the fact that the animal then perished completely in the fire that symbolized the total nature of the offerer's dedication.
And the requirements for the animal were surprisingly flexible, which I think speaks to a kind of social equity.
That speaks profoundly to the principle of proportionality and grace. Yeah. Acceptable animals varied widely. A bull, a lamb, a goat.
Or even birds.
Or even turtle doves and pigeons. And those bird offerings were a specific concession to the poor, ensuring that even the humblest Israelite could fulfill this basic requirement of communion.
So was the cost just irrelevant then?
No, not at all. The principle was that greater responsibility before God often required a larger, more expensive animal. Someone with a higher status, like a priest or a tribal leader, their sin caused a greater pollution.
So their sacrifice was expected to reflect that greater capacity and responsibility.
Precisely.
Okay, so if the burnt offering gives God your life, your total surrender, then the meal offering, or mincha in chapter 2, seems to deal with your labor.
That's an excellent conceptual link. The meal offering was a grain offering, fine flour, cakes, that sort of thing. It was a symbolic tribute of human labor and sustenance.
So by offering it, the Israelite was committing his works, his daily bread, to the Lord.
Yes. It was basically saying, my ability to produce this food, it comes from you, and I acknowledge that.
But it's unique because it wasn't burned completely.
Right. Only a memorial portion, just a handful, was offered up in smoke as a soothing aroma. The rest of it was eaten by the priests.
Making it most holy.
Most holy, yes. This is the only major sacrifice where humankind, represented by the priesthood, derived most of the material benefit.
And what's the implication there? What does that symbolize?
It symbolized that the works of human endeavor, when done for the benefit of our fellow man, also please God. The labor is consecrated to God, but the sustenance from that labor goes to support those serving in his sanctuary.
And the ingredients themselves are just loaded with symbolism. We have olive oil, frankincense, and salt.
Yeah, each one is significant. The olive oil symbolized God's enabling spirit, binding the dry flour into a usable offering. It suggests that our labor has to be energized by the Spirit.
And the frankincense.
Frankincense was this costly, fragrant spice that only released its strong aroma when it was subjected to fire. It's a beautiful parallel for dedication and gratitude, which often only become evident when they're tested by affliction.
And the salt was mandatory in all of them.
It was called the salt of the covenant. Salt preserves. It can't be destroyed by fire or time. So it symbolized that the covenant relationship was eternal, incorruptible, and unbreakable. Every act of devotion had to be offered with that understanding.
And just as important were the two ingredients that were strictly forbidden.
Yeast and honey. Both were forbidden because they caused fermentation. And fermentation in this symbolic system suggested decay, corruption, or impurity.
So God demands the best, unblemished by any compromise.
Exactly.
Okay, that brings us to the last of the communion offerings, the peace offering, or shalom, in chapter 3. What made this one different?
This was entirely voluntary and festive. It wasn't demanded by sin or by daily duty. It was offered in thanksgiving, or to fulfill a vow, or just as a simple free will offering.
So it celebrated the peace and fellowship that resulted from a right relationship with God.
Yes, exactly. It's a celebration of blessings already received.
And the key element here, the thing that really set it apart, was the shared meal.
This is the most important distinctive. All three participants shared in it. God received the very best parts, the fat, which was burned completely on the altar.
Okay.
The priest received specific portions, the breast and the thigh. And then the offerer ate the remainder of the meat with his family and his friends.
So it was a profound act of social and spiritual bonding, a communal meal.
Precisely. In the ancient Near East, eating a ritual meal together committed people to one another in a strong bond of loyalty and fellowship. This was the ultimate seal of covenant fellowship, celebrated by all the covenant partners together.
But even in this celebration, that strict prohibition reappears. You must never eat any fat or any blood.
And we really need to reiterate why. The fat was considered the best part, the richest part. It signified that God was worthy of the absolute best. But the blood was strictly reserved because, as the text explicitly states, the life of every living thing is in the blood.
And since blood was the medium of atonement, it belonged exclusively to God.
Exclusively. To eat it was seen as despising life itself and arrogantly using the medium of cleansing for just common consumption.
Okay, now we transition pretty sharply from worship to restoration. We're moving to the offerings of expiation and repair, starting with the sin offering, the hatat, in chapter 4. If the first three celebrated relationship, this one is trying to fix it.
And it was foundational. I mean, you often had to offer this one before you could offer any of the others. Its primary focus was dealing with unwitting or inadvertent sins.
Sins of weakness or ignorance or omission.
Right. It demonstrated an underlying generalized sinful nature that caused pollution.
Can you elaborate on that pollution principle? Because I think it's central to understanding this whole book.
It really is. In their worldview, sin isn't just a moral failing, it's a spiritual defilement. It pollutes the place where it happens, and especially God's sanctuary, which is the epicenter of holiness.
So the sin offering's main goal was purification. It's like a spiritual hazmat team.
That's a great analogy. It cleanses the worship space so that God can continue to be present among his people without consuming them in judgment. The sprinkling and smearing of the blood was literally the act of decontamination.
And the protocol for this offering was dictated by the status of the sinner, which illustrates that responsibility increases with privilege.
Absolutely. The variations were based on who sinned. The anointed priest, the whole congregation, a leader, or a common person. The more influential the sinner, the greater the pollution their sin caused.
So the blood had to be taken deeper into the sacred space depending on who the offender was.
Correct. When the high priest or the whole congregation sinned, the pollution was so great that the blood had to be taken inside the tabernacle itself and sprinkled 7 times before the veil. It acknowledged the defilement reached the deepest sacred levels.
But for a private citizen?
For a private citizen, the pollution was limited to the outer court, and the blood was only smeared on the horns of the altar of burnt sacrifice.
But in every single case, the core concept of substitution was paramount.
Without a doubt, the entire system relied on vicarious atonement. An innocent, spotless substitute replaced the sinner, bearing the judgment for sin, which allowed the sinner to live and the sanctuary to be cleansed.
That brings us to the last of the 5, the trespass offering, or Eshem in chapter 5. How do we draw a clear functional line between the sin offering and this one?
The best way to think about it is conceptually. The sin offering, the hat art, it cleanses the space. It deals with that underlying state of uncleanness or general pollution caused by sin.
Okay.
The trespass offering, the asham, it pays the bill. It focuses specifically on sins involving a quantifiable violation or trespass against God, or more often against another person.
So if I inadvertently broke a rule I didn't know about, that's a sin offering.
Right.
But if I stole from my neighbor or cheated someone or violated God's holy things in a way that caused a material loss, that's a trespass offering.
Exactly. The focus shifts from cleansing the spiritual environment to making reparation for specific damage.
Yeah.
The Hebrew word asham actually means both guilt and reparation.
Yeah.
Guilt isn't just a feeling, it's a condition that carries a price.
And that price included a mandatory penalty.
Yes, this offering required the offerer not only to restore whatever had been violated, money, an object, whatever it was,
Yep.
but also to add 1/5 or 20% as a penalty. It demonstrated that true repentance went beyond just saying sorry with a sacrifice. It required making the injured party completely whole, and then some.
That's a system designed to discourage offenses by making them fiscally painful.
It demands full accountability. It ensures that the cost of sin isn't just borne by an innocent animal, but also by the sinner's wallet. It established justice and restoration as core components of their relationship with God and with each other.
So we've established what to offer. Now let's transition to who offers them and the incredibly rigorous standards required for the priesthood. This starts in chapter 8 with the consecration ceremony.
This was the official launch of the Aaronic priesthood. And it's interesting, Moses acts as the primary mediator here. He's the one executing the ritual, washing, clothing, anointing Aaron and his sons.
And the anointing oil was crucial.
It was. It signified that they were set apart for holy purposes and filled with the power of God's Spirit to enable them to do their duties.
Then the ritual took a very physical turn with the application of blood. This detail really underscores how comprehensive their dedication had to be.
It does. Blood from the peace offering was applied to Aaron's right earlobe, the thumb of his right hand, and the big toe of his right foot.
The symbolism there seems pretty direct.
It's profound. It taught that the priest's entire person, his mind, his actions, his walk, had to be consecrated to God. The ear, because he was always to listen to God's word. The hand, because he was to discharge his duties properly. And the foot, because he was to walk correctly and reverently in the sanctuary.
And this consecration wasn't a quick thing. It lasted a full 7 days, right? A period of sacred isolation.
A full week. And then, in chapter 9, we have the grand opening, the inauguration of tabernacle worship.
The 8th day, a new beginning.
It is. And we see this powerful, poignant detail right at the start. Aaron's very first sacrifice offered for his own sin was a bull calf.
And it is impossible to read that without thinking about the golden calf he made back in Exodus.
You can't. It's as if he had to atone for his greatest failure first. It's a powerful reminder that even those closest to God are still deeply human and sinful.
So after Aaron offered all the mandatory sacrifices for himself and for the people, then came the climax of the whole consecration.
The big moment.
What happened when the ritual was finally complete?
Fire went out miraculously from the presence of the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat parts on the altar. It was God manifesting his satisfaction, a sudden, visible yes, that the offerings were acceptable and the pattern was correct.
And that brought forth great joy among the people.
A huge celebration.
And yet, chapter 10 immediately crashes that celebration with one of the most sobering warnings in the entire Old Testament. The judgment of Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's 2 eldest sons.
The irony is just chilling. The very same miraculous holy fire that consecrated Aaron and accepted the offerings brought immediate destruction upon his sons.
So what was their sin exactly? They were offering incense, they were performing their duties.
Their sin was offering strange fire, which the text clarifies as uncommanded. This wasn't an act of, paganism or just indifference. It was an act of unauthorized innovation.
It was disobedience.
Disobedience and a failure to treat the Lord as holy. They were trying to approach God on their own terms, not his.
And Moses' response to Aaron is just terrifying in its clarity. Among the ones close to me, I will show myself holy, and in the presence of all the people, I will be honored.
I mean, this incident is a perennial warning against self-made worship, what we might call zeal without knowledge. It cautions against worshiping God in ways we prefer just because they make us feel good or because they're convenient, rather than honoring God as he is specifically instructed.
Proximity to holiness demands meticulous obedience.
It does. He is not just loving, he is holy.
And immediately after that trauma, the Lord speaks directly to Aaron, not just Moses, with regulations on temperance.
Which is directly connected to the failure of Nadab and Abihu. The priests were prohibited from drinking wine or strong drink before entering the meeting tent,
And why was that?
because temperance was essential for their primary duty, distinguishing correctly between the holy and the common, and between the clean and the unclean. Intoxication dulls the moral and spiritual senses, leading to rash, foolish behavior like offering strange fire, which is totally incompatible with spiritual service.
Okay, now we transition away from the ritual heart of the sanctuary to holiness in daily life, chapters 11 through 15. The core message seems to be that holiness isn't just for priests on duty.
That's the genius of Leviticus. Holiness has to govern what you eat, where you live, and what your body does. This section deals with ritual contamination, where impurity results in separation from the fellowship of the sanctuary.
Starting with the famous dietary laws in chapter 11. The law for land animals required a double criteria for them to be considered edible.
They had to have a divided hoof and chew the cud. And this was highly specific. The camel, for instance, failed because it chewed the cud, but didn't have a divided hoof.
And the pig failed because it had a divided hoof but didn't chew the cud.
Exactly. You had to have both.
So why this restriction? Was it just about health or hygiene?
While there may have been some practical benefits, the primary reason was deeply theological. The Israelite restricted his food to serve as a constant visible reminder that he owed his spiritual privileges entirely to divine election.
It was a sign of their chosen status.
A daily visible sign. Just as God chose certain animals, he had chosen one nation, Israel, to be set apart as a holy nation among the Gentiles.
The law regarding pollution and death is also very telling.
Right, because death is an abnormal condition for living beings. It's the ultimate result of sin. The text notes that only dead, unclean animals caused pollution.
So if you touched a carcass,
You had to perform an immediate ritual washing, and you remained unclean until evening. The pollution was manageable, but it still required cleansing before you could approach the sacred.
Now, moving to impurity from the human body in chapters 12 and 15, we need to be very clear that unclean did not mean sinful.
This is a critical distinction for any modern reader. Ceremonial defilement, or impurity, was a condition, not necessarily a moral sin. A perfect example is the childbirth rites in chapter 12.
Giving birth was obviously not a sin.
Of course not. But it resulted in a ritual impurity that restricted the mother's participation in corporate worship for a time.
And there was a difference in the purification time, 40 days for a son, 80 for a daughter. Why the extended period for a daughter?
The text doesn't explicitly say why the time was doubled, but the duration was required because the woman's presence in the camp, having experienced this natural but profaning event, ritually contaminated the altar. She was required to bring a sin offering.
Which was a recognition that even natural life processes in a sinful world require cleansing before a holy God.
Precisely, and this is where we get that powerful New Testament detail. Mary, the mother of Jesus, adhered to these rites and brought the poor person's sacrifice of 2 birds for her purification.
Which tells us 2 things, her piety and her family's poverty.
Yes. The law was careful to make provision so the poor could always approach God.
Chapter 15 then deals with bodily discharges, whether from disease or natural causes. The principle here seems to be separation from the sanctuary.
Absolutely. The overarching principle was that anything connected with the flow of blood or sexual function was categorized as common, physical, mortal, and could not be brought into the highly restricted supernatural space of the sanctuary. Uncleanness disqualified you from public covenantal worship.
It was for their own protection.
Exactly, to ensure they did not die by defiling God's tabernacle that rested right there in their midst.
Then we get to chapters 13 and 14 concerning skin abnormalities. Here, the priest essentially shifts from being a spiritual mediator to a public health inspector.
That's the right way to frame it. His treatment wasn't curative medicine, it was ritual diagnosis. The goal was to determine the individual's status for worship. And the underlying theological principle is that holiness is symbolized by wholeness, physical, moral, and social integrity.
So if someone showed a persistent, visible lack of wholeness, a spreading skin disease, often translated as leprosy, they were excluded from the covenant community.
And that physical exclusion was a visible, temporary representation of the effects of sin, which also separates a person from God and from other people. The exclusion was ruthless because preserving the purity of the tabernacle and the holiness of the nation took absolute precedence.
But chapter 14 gives us the hope of restoration. A really powerful two-part rite for someone who was healed.
This is an incredibly rich ritual. The process began outside the camp, signifying restoration to the community. It involved two live, clean birds, some cedar wood, crimson fabric, and hyssop.
Describe the symbolism of those two birds. It's fascinating.
It really is. One bird was slain, and its blood provided atonement, the necessary judgment for the defilement. The other bird was then dipped in that bloody water.
The live one.
The live one, yes. And it was then released to fly away over the open countryside. It's this profound image of guilt and defilement being symbolically removed, carried far away from the community, declaring the person free and clean.
That must have been a powerful emotional moment.
I can't imagine. But the restoration wasn't complete yet. The second part was restoration to the sanctuary. That happened on the 8th day at the altar.
And it involved a whole new set of offerings.
The mandatory trespass, sin, and burnt offerings, culminating in the application of blood and oil to the healed person's ear, thumb, and toe, mirroring the priest's own consecration.
So they're being reconsecrated back into full worship.
Exactly. Their ability to hear God's word, perform right actions, and walk in holiness had to be ritually affirmed. The Lord provided a meticulous way back in.
I also found the concept of house infections in chapter 14 so striking that even inanimate objects could be contaminated.
It just underscores the pervasive nature of corruption. Yellowish green or reddish patches on the walls could signal a malignant disease in the structure itself.
And the remedy was extreme.
It was. It required scraping, replastering, or, if it was resistant, total demolition. The stones and wood had to be taken to an unclean place outside the city.
Why such intensity over what might just be mold?
Because decay and corruption, even in the physical environment, are incompatible with the holiness of the Lord. If God is dwelling in the center of the camp, that standard of purity has to extend outwards to the very stones of their houses. They lived in a quarantined, sacred space.
Which brings us to Section V, the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, in chapter 16. If daily life required constant spot cleaning, this day was the annual national deep clean.
It was the single most solemn day of the year, 6 months after Passover. And crucially, the instructions are placed immediately after the death of Nadab and Abihu, serving as a permanent reminder of the immense danger involved in approaching God's holy presence.
And the high priest's preparation for this day emphasized humility above all else.
Yes, Aaron was forbidden from wearing his ornate, glorious garments. He had to wear simple white linen, the uniform of a servant.
Emphasizing humility and self-cleansing.
Right. He first had to offer sacrifices to atone for his own sins before he even dared to attempt atonement for the people.
And the climax of the day was the powerful ritual of the two goats.
Aaron cast lots. One goat was for the Lord, and the other was for Azazel, the scapegoat.
It was the one for the Lord.
That one was slain. It represented the judgment on sin, the death necessary for atonement, and its blood was taken into the Holy of Holies, the ritual climax of the entire year, and sprinkled on the mercy seat.
And the scapegoat, what was its function?
The scapegoat, Azazel, was unique. Aaron confessed all the people's iniquities and transgressions directly over the live goat's head, ritually transferring the collective sin of the nation onto this animal.
And then it was sent away.
Led by a designated man in the inaccessible land, the wilderness, symbolizing the complete removal of guilt, far from God's presence, never to return.
The imagery is incredible. The two animals taught them that a sinless agent was both suffering the required judgment, that's the slain goat, and removing their sins completely, the scapegoat.
Yet, we have to stress the non-finality of it. This elaborate, deeply meaningful ritual had to be repeated every single year. It pointed clearly to the inability of animal sacrifices to permanently erase sin.
But God promised forgiveness to those who trusted the system he prescribed.
Yes, to all who trusted in its efficacy.
And the requirement for the people themselves was equally strict. They had to humble yourselves, fasting, repenting, and do no work of any kind.
This was profound. It affirmed that the yearly removal of sins was entirely God's provision and God's work. Humans contributed absolutely nothing by way of labor or merit. It demanded complete trust, submission, and humility from the entire nation.
We shift now to the second half of the book, the path of obedience. Having dealt with ritual purity, Leviticus turns to how holiness must be maintained in private life.
The message is crystal clear. Holiness isn't confined to the sanctuary. It has to govern every interaction in the camp. Chapter 17, for instance, focuses on the sanctity of life and blood outside the formal sanctuary.
And that's where we get that strange regulation that all animal slaughter had to happen before the tent of meeting. Why?
It was primarily a barrier against syncretism and idolatry. It prevented pagan rituals involving goat demons, fertility gods worshipped by the Egyptians and Canaanites. The rule reinforced that every killing of a clean animal was an act of worship to Yahweh, the true owner of life.
It prevented them from slipping into hidden pagan practices.
Exactly. And this section reiterates the absolute prohibition against eating blood.
Because the life of every living thing is in the blood.
Right. Since blood was the sacred medium of atonement, using it for common consumption was inappropriate, almost blasphemous. By refraining, they honored the sanctity of life and the unique purpose God assigned to blood.
Chapters 18 and 20 cover the strict sexual and moral ethics required. What was the rationale for such harsh laws?
The rationale was absolute separation. Israel had to differentiate itself clearly from the corrupt practices of Egypt where they'd come from and Canaan where they were going. The sexual laws protected the purity and integrity of the family unit.
Which the divine code saw as the cornerstone of a stable, holy society.
Absolutely.
The list of prohibitions is severe: incest, adultery, homosexuality, bestiality. What was the ultimate consequence promised for violating these?
The ultimate consequence was terrifyingly graphic. God warned that the land itself, having been defiled by the preceding nations, would literally vomit you out if Israel practiced these abominations.
So these weren't just personal sins, they were sins that corrupted the very land.
Yes, they shattered the social structure, broke down family lines, and profaned the image of God in humanity, making the nation morally intolerable to the land itself.
And the extreme crime of Molech worship is highlighted as profoundly profaning God's name.
Molech worship, sacrificing your own children, was detestable, not only to violate the sanctity of life, but for Israel to engage in such a hideous perversion gave God, whose name they carried, a bad reputation among the Gentiles. It was the ultimate betrayal.
Chapter 19 then shifts focus entirely to social justice and economic holiness, how holiness plays out with your neighbors in the marketplace and the field.
And this chapter is arguably the crown jewel of Leviticus's ethical instruction. It contains that direct, simple yet radical command: you must love your neighbor as yourself.
It shows that holiness isn't attained by fleeing the world.
No, it's attained by the spirit in which we fulfill the obligations of life in its simplest, most common details.
Give us some of those concrete agricultural examples of what that neighborly love looks like in practice.
It meant leaving the gleanings of the harvest and the fallen grapes for the poor and the resident foreigner. It meant not oppressing a hired laborer by withholding his wages overnight. It meant not cursing the deaf or putting a stumbling block before the blind.
These are acts of deep social compassion.
They are. And the treatment of the foreigner is given special, crucial status.
Which is radical for an ancient society.
It's unbelievable. The rule is, the resident foreigner who lives with you must be to you as a native citizen among you, so you must love the foreigner as yourself, because you are foreigners in the land of Egypt. The foundation of the law is empathy, rooted in their own history of being outsiders.
And holiness also extended right into the ledger book and the market stall.
Honesty had to be total. God required honest balances, honest weights, and honest measures, the honest ephah and hin. Conformity to God's holiness required unwavering justice and kindness in every transaction.
Chapter 24 contains the famous law of retaliation: fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And so many people today misread that as a barbaric demand for vengeance.
What's fascinating here is that the purpose was the exact opposite. In ancient societies, injury often led to escalating revenge. A broken tooth might merit the killing of the offender's entire family.
So this law was intended to limit retaliation.
Precisely. It insisted that the punishment fit the crime exactly. It upheld equal justice for all, preventing runaway vengeance and confining punishment to the exact measure of the injury.
Finally, let's examine the major economic structure in Chapter 25, the Jubilee year. This is perhaps the most radically challenging of all the laws.
It truly is radical. Israel's life was governed by a 7-year sabbatical cycle. After 7 of those cycles, 49 years, the 50th year was the Jubilee.
Announced with a loud horn blast on the Day of Atonement.
Yes, announcing a complete economic reset.
And what was the scope of this mandatory reset?
It proclaimed a release of 3 things. First, the land rested completely. Second, all land had to revert to its original tribal owner, no matter how many times it had been sold. And third, all Israelite servants went free.
Why could land never be permanently sold? That seems entirely counter to most economic systems, ancient or modern.
Because the underlying theological foundation dictated the economic philosophy. The land belongs to God.
The Israelites were just tenants.
Exactly. They were foreign residents, temporary settlers on God's property. So when they bought or sold property, they weren't selling the land itself, but only the value of the remaining years of harvest until the Great Jubilee reset.
This mechanism must have been incredibly disruptive, but what did it guarantee for the society?
Economic stability. It guaranteed that no Israelite would be permanently reduced to debt bondage or lose his ancestral inheritance forever. It was a constant celebration of their redemption from Egyptian slavery, affirming that since they were God's servants, they couldn't be sold into permanent servitude to one another.
It was a massive engine for social
A
equity.
huge one.
And the final chapter, 26, pulls everything together in the ultimate covenant reminder: blessings and curses.
This lays out the non-negotiable consequences of the nation's collective choice. Obedience brings the carrot. Fruitful harvests, security, immense military victory. That famous phrase, 5 pursuing 100. And most importantly, the increasing enjoyment of God's presence.
And the curses, the stick, were structured as 5 escalating levels of judgment, not for individual errors, but for contemptuous rebellion.
Right. These included initial warnings like disease and famine, escalating to attacks by wild animals, and eventually culminating in the full destruction of the nation through war, plague, and finally national dispersion. This was judgment for a settled, deliberate rejection of the covenant.
But the chapter ends not with despair, but with a crucial promise of restoration.
And that's the final necessary nugget of grace. Despite the severity of the judgment, God promised he would not utterly reject them. If Israel confessed their national iniquity and their uncircumcised hearts become humbled, God promised to remember his unconditional covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and eventually restore the land.
Discipline was always intended to produce repentance and restoration.
Always.
This book is so much more complex and foundational than its reputation suggests. We've seen the rigorous progression. God is holy, sin requires costly atonement, and that holiness has to be expressed in daily ethical living outside the sanctuary walls.
The revelational value is that it established an unshakable truth. For a holy God to have a close, intimate relationship with redeemed yet sinful people, comprehensive atonement is mandatory. And the rules of purity were required for his continued, terrifyingly close dwelling in their midst.
And while the book is foundational, the New Testament confirms that the ritual and regulatory aspects ended with Christ's perfect sacrifice.
Yes, Christ's life and death fulfilled all the types and shadows. Jesus terminated the dietary restrictions, declaring all foods clean. And the writer of Hebrews saw Christ as the eternal high priest, whose one-time sacrifice perfected the worshiper and ended the need for any more sin offerings or Yom Kippur rituals.
So in the ritual application, those old laws are obsolete.
Obsolete, yeah.
However, the moral and ethical foundation remains solid.
Absolutely. The core ethical and moral laws about family purity, social justice, treating the vulnerable, and economic fairness, especially from chapters 18, 19, and 20, were all restated and universally affirmed in the New Testament. The demand for separation from the world's immoral and unjust practices remains our enduring mandate.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner, today? The ancient laws of purity demanded physical separation and constant ritual to maintain holiness. Christ's blood now provides complete cleansing, removing the need for that physical isolation and animal sacrifice.
And those rules of purity dictated a physical separation from the common and the unclean. So since Christ has removed those ritual barriers, how effectively do you now maintain your own holiness by separating yourself from the world's immoral, corrupt, and unjust practices, those actions that the land itself threatened to vomit out?
And perhaps more immediately, do you apply the Levitical principle of the Jubilee, that constant reset toward equity and justice, by genuinely practicing the command to love your neighbor and the resident foreigner as yourself in your modern economic and social life? That is the ultimate test of the enduring law.